Hello, and thanks so much for attending this talk. My name is Michelle Sikes, and I'm an associate professor at Penn State University. I'll dive right in. That's really the power of sports. It breaks down barriers of every kind, of language, of geography, of politics, and especially when it comes to football, to soccer for some of us in the United States, it may be the most powerful unifier in the world, declared U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the 2023 Africa Cup of Nations, first round match between host Cote d'Ivoire and Equatorial Guinea. As you'll see here, there's Blinken in the image. He had just landed in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire's largest city, and went straight to the match, a decision that Barron's magazine described as an effort to, quote, show a softer side to the United States. Welcomed with a Cote d'Ivoire national team jersey bearing his name, the chief architect of American foreign policy watched from an air-conditioned VIP suite alongside the country's prime minister, vice president, and foreign minister. He described the tournament as another, quote, another way of building bridges between the United States and Africa, adding, we're doing a lot of actual building of infrastructure, but this is building connections between people. Yet the very stadium where Blinken delivered those remarks gave tangible form to the geopolitical landscape of football or soccer diplomacy. The 60,000-seat Olympic Stadium, named for President Alassane Ouattara, was financed not by the United States but by China. Since the 1970s, China has invested in building stadiums across Africa as part of a strategy to strengthen diplomatic and commercial ties. These efforts accelerated under the Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, which expanded China's infrastructure footprint across Africa, Asia, and Europe. Scholars Xinfeng Kuo and Sanwei Kuo describe this strategy as, quote, building the landscape of sport diplomacy. The scale of this investment is unmatched by other nations in terms of stadium building efforts. Since 1958, China has built or financed 133 major sports venues globally, 94 of them in Africa. The Shanghai Construction Group built the Friendship Stadium in Gabon in just 20 months, while in Maputo, Mozambique, the national stadium bears an inscription in Chinese and Portuguese proclaiming, quote, the friendship between China and Mozambique will last forever, like the heavens and the earth. And as of the early 2020s, sports scholar Itamar Dubinsky notes, Chinese companies, typically contracted after the Chinese government brokered funding agreements, had built or were constructing facilities in 45 of Africa's 54 nations. This presentation is based on the introduction to a volume that Heather Dichter and I are co-editing, titled Football Diplomacy Beyond Europe. That contribution takes Blinken's AFCON appearance in a stadium constructed by Chinese state-owned enterprises as an entry point into two mechanisms of football diplomacy, infrastructure and media. Both themes animate modern sport history and influence how sport diplomacy works in practice. Recent scholarship across multiple subfields has treated infrastructure as projects that reorganize space, labor, finance, and public life. As historian Mary Bridges has argued in her discussion of the infrastructural turn in historical scholarship, studying infrastructure, the interconnected systems that enable societies to function, offers a way to understand power through technology and material systems. For diplomatic historians, too, this approach is useful because it allows examination of relationships that often sit between familiar levels of analysis, bridging high policy and everyday life, and national strategies and local effects, by focusing attention on the material forms through which state and non-state power operate. Sport, we argue, is uniquely suited to this perspective. Stadiums are an unmistakable form of sport infrastructure, doing diplomatic work by binding nations through their construction and by gathering bodies, fans in the stands, and athletes on the pitch to be seen, narrated, and remembered. In historian Frank Andre Guridi's formulation, stadiums have functioned as public gathering sites where people express belonging and dissent in ways that can transcend sport itself. Sports media, too, forms part of the story as an outgrowth of communications infrastructure. Diplomacy takes place through international tournaments construed as spectacles that invite people to interpret athletic performance as an indicator of national capacity. As historian Barbara Keyes notes, quote, sport becomes a useful arena for governments eager to display the virtues of their national systems. Both stadiums and sports media then bring together large groups of people as audiences to consume sport and to absorb the ideas and ideologies that it is intended to convey. In this sense, the authors and editors of this volume treat football diplomacy as inseparable from the infrastructures that make the game the world's most popular sport, with the stadium a long-lasting physical representation of cooperation and national ambition, and media the networked systems that turn athletic encounters into widely consumed political narratives. Consider the African Cup of Nations, the continent's main biennial football tournament and one of its most popular sports events, which frequently draws attention to China's stadium diplomacy. 6 of the last 9 AFCON tournaments have been held in Chinese-backed venues. Angola's 2010 AFCON tournament, announcing its post-Civil War recovery after nearly 3 decades of conflict, was held in 4 stadiums financed by China at a cost of $600 million. In such cases, football was the event through which people saw and interpreted stadium diplomacy. The history of Chinese aid shows how these sporting spectacles came to be staged so often in Chinese-financed arenas. China's infrastructural assistance in other nations began in the 50s and expanded in the 60s as a centralized state-led program to advance its diplomatic relationships around the world through formal agreements between governments, initially concentrated in East and Southeast Asia before becoming more geographically expansive. In the late 60s and 70s, when Sino-Soviet relations were fraying and relations with the US had not yet fully normalized, the diplomatic value of this assistance was especially important, with overseas technical and construction assistance helping to cultivate goodwill and expand trade with post-colonial partners. Beijing pursued international recognition as the legitimate government of China and sought influence by aligning with decolonizing states, using an anti-imperial ideology in solidarity against continuing forms of imperial influence. Chinese-backed stadiums and multi-sport complexes operated as a subset of this infrastructural diplomacy. Huge sport venues tied national prestige to structures that, as architectural historian Robin Hartanto-Hungare notes, quote, captured the imagination of political leaders and the public alike. China completed its first stadium project in 1958 when it helped deliver the National Sports Stadium in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. Also that year, Beijing withdrew from the Olympic movement entirely in protest of the IOC's, quote, two Chinas policy, allowing Taiwan's identity as the Republic of China. Choosing instead to link sport development to post-colonial solidarity and nation building, by 1970, China expanded stadium construction into Africa with the 15,000-seat Amman Stadium in Zanzibar, its first project on the continent. These histories show that finance, design, labor, and construction enhance the diplomatic potential of football, which the tournaments and spectacles that fill these venues with meaning then activated. The infrastructures of sport can bind states and corporations, as Chinese-backed stadiums show, while furnishing opportunities for competing narratives of national identity and international belonging. If stadium diplomacy provides one avenue into football diplomacy, the broader contribution of the volume emerges from the uneven geography of the football world itself. As political scientist, Rhodes Scholar, and influential scholar of international relations Joseph Nye has noted, power is distributed differently across different spheres of world politics. And Western Europe remains the metropole of the sport by many metrics. The UEFA Champions League today stands as the most prestigious club competition globally, a spectacle of elite talent and financial might. European clubs benefit from vast investments by multinational corporations, wealthy individuals, and sovereign wealth funds, allowing them to dominate transfer markets and outspend rivals on facilities and player development. Leagues such as the Premier League, La Liga, the Bundesliga, and Serie A command the most profitable television contracts globally, while European nations have consistently excelled at the highest level at the World Cup. In other ways, football has never neatly mirrored the contours of global geopolitical power. As football historian Brenda Elsie observes, if that were true, then the dominance of players from the global south would reflect the power of their homelands in global affairs. During the Cold War, smaller nations often enjoyed greater prestige in international football than either superpower. For 8 consecutive tournaments, from 1954 to 1986, the U.S. men's national team failed to qualify for the World Cup, and the Soviet Union missed out on the 1974 and 78 tournaments and returned only in 1982 for what historian Mauricio Barrero describes as, quote, the first of 3 successive, but ultimately forgettable appearances. So we turn our focus to nations on the periphery of Europe's footballing stronghold to examine how, in this second century of football, they employ the sport as a tool for diplomacy. These initiatives speak to quests for recognition, legitimacy, and soft power, defined here as influence achieved through attraction rather than coercion, a concept popularized by Nye to explain how culture and values can influence international outcomes. Although the term is relatively recent, states have recognized much earlier that culture could be potentially consequential, and Cold War rivalries accelerated these strategies. Historians Penny von Eschen for jazz and Damian Thomas for sport show that U.S. officials treated both domains as tools of persuasion by sending musicians and athletes abroad as cultural ambassadors to counter criticism of American racism and to promote a desired image of democracy and modernity. Less powerful nations also decided that sport, alongside other cultural forms such as music, offered a way to exert diplomatic power, although in football, their efforts often took place within structures still heavily shaped by European influence, whether in FIFA governance, global media narratives, or commercial revenue flows. Despite these constraints, football has provided a means of advancing foreign policy objectives through which nations around the world built alliances and projected influence, with the ubiquity of football allowing countries to use the game as part of their diplomatic endeavors. So, to wrap this up, the invocation of the soft power of football by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken at an AFCON tournament in Cote d'Ivoire, held in a stadium financed by China, one of the United States' chief global rivals, illustrates the diplomatic terrain the book explores. The volume argues that football diplomacy arises through infrastructures that materially bind partners and enable hosting, through media that transforms local encounters into global narratives, and through actors, including political leaders, diplomats, athletes, and fans, whose interests and interpretations sometimes diverged and sometimes cohered. The diplomatic power of the sport lies in its capacity to generate repeated moments of contact and international visibility, particularly for nations beyond the traditional powerhouses of the sport. Thank you very much for your attention.